Byzantine culture from the 7th century onwards especially starts becoming really sclerotic, self-referential. Read the strategicon and then read Leo the Wise's tactica. Basically, this was an emperor, in the latter case, that was copying the former work, literally letter by letter, and just adding something on his own every once in a while, notionistically, like changing, I don't know, before the strategicon talked about the hours, he was referring mostly now to the Bulgars, to the Magyars, right? This kind of things. It's just a classicistic imitation. This is what basically the Byzantine culture in some self-referential way turns into. It is true that there is actually a blossoming of Byzantine literature in the 9th and the 10th, the following centuries, but this is absolutely not comparable, not by size, not by quality, not by general output, by any indicator to the Western one. They are also still very self-referential. They still take info and references from very specific classical models. The West has gone far beyond, while still also using classical stuff like crazy, but innovating, creating more, developing further on it. And we will see it definitely in other videos specifically dedicated to literature. What happens in the 6th and the 7th century in Italy, in Spain, and Gaul is that the originally barbarian establishment was integrated in the Roman political institutional system. It's easy to make the case, okay, but the Germans kind of conquered these regions, like, so now we should reason in terms, they were the ones who were ruling everything and, like, you know, destroyed Rome or challenged it or substituted it in some way. No. These people start legislating in Latin. These people try to salvage as much as possible whichever Roman administration had existed up to that point. We see it in the more Romanized cases when late antiquity still existed, like among the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians. We see it among the Longobards. We see it also among the Franks, or even the Anglo-Saxons, where of course there was a possibility of doing so. So the maintenance of the local infrastructure. We're talking about that in part also, even for Anglo-Saxon and in parallel sort of Arthurian, Romano-Britannic Britain. We have, in this sense, also pretty extensive archaeological evidence of that. It's not like this system has not shrunk. Everybody has shrunk, right? The Byzantine Empire has essentially shrunk. The Roman Empire as well had shrunk. These systems gradually also dry up towards the second half of the 6th century, Justinian plague. This happens everywhere. It happens in China. It happens in India. Everybody's suffering. The Barbaricum, broadly meant, is empty. All these peoples, again, had started fleeing from this misery and also killing each other, and large places there had gone underpopulated, so it's not really a prosper time for anyone involved. Here we're talking about the relative terms between one another. And there is definitely no doubt, in comparison, that while, again, the Latin Germanic West successfully establishes countries, by the way, that will last until today. Everybody says this for the Byzantines. The Byzantine Empire lasts a millennium. Oh my God, how they made it. It's incredible. What about, I don't know, England? What about France? You can argue maybe about Spain. Italy is also not that arguable in the sense that there was a Longobard kingdom. It basically took over almost everything from the same Byzantines that eventually became the Carolingian kingdom. It was even equated to the Frankish one by the same Charlemagne. And you see how much we have sort of self-sabotaged our own sense of ourselves. Like, we think the Byzantine Empire suddenly in non-national terms. I know there's most people that are actually reviving this obsession. This is the point. What was happening, again, in the East? What was happening in the Byzantine Empire during the terrible dark ages of the Latin Germanic world, of people living in stinky, muddy, smoky huts, allegedly, and not taking baths in the still functioning Roman thermae? Well, while the West was Romanizing its elite, and so you have an active Romanization, imperialization, and Catholicization, to the point of having Saxon emperors defining them as metaphysically, ethnically Romans, this world of Constantinople was witnessing the diametrically opposite dynamic. Everybody knows that the Balkan, the Anatolian hinterland, was being barbarized. And we're talking about, let's stick to Europe, let's stick to the Balkans essentially. We're talking provinces that for centuries had participated up to that point to the Mediterranean civilization. Macedon, Epirus, the same Roman Balkans. I made a video about Moesia, for example. Also particularly developed, and it's a part where, in fact, that Latin tongue kept being spoken up to this point. This area was the Byzantine world. You have Greece at large also was pretty consistent civilizationally in the ancient world. This stuff gets all dried up, and not only that, we've seen that power shrinks everywhere, but the local population does not get Romanized, it gets barbarized. Now you can argue that, well, okay, these people, yes, we know that, the Slavs were, what we call them, were swarming into the Balkans. It wasn't even properly a capacity to stop them. Some of them settled into the Peloponnesian hinterland, where Slavic was actually spoken. We've seen it by the 13th century in the video about the Battle of Pelagonia. There were the Tsakonas. There was this historically interland reality that, to be fair, was not even fully, of course, ever Greek or whatever in antiquity. Right? Think about even the Illyrian emperors. In part, we know that these had remained like the Isaurians in Anatolia, some of the least developed and least Romanized populations that, however, saved the empire in the name of Romanization. We'll talk more about the Illyrian emperors because, again, the imperial Catholic tradition is not an opinion. Those peoples there understood that. History does not work. It's like, let's tear down the empire. No, these people understood what the empire was, and they tried themselves to preserve it as much as they could. The same Slavs were entering the Byzantine Empire were not coming there together with the Avars, the Bulgars, other raiders, by saying, okay, we just have to destroy this thing. They were just to, some of them would, especially the Slavs, would settle largely, and would, in fact, become Byzantine subjects. So, Romaioi, if you see how in the generations they were subjects of Constantinople, sitting in the midst, say, of Greece, as we pointed out now, and not being, of course, Franks or Arabs or whatever. But were these people truly, I don't know, they were starting living like Greek people? They would start even speaking the Greek language? Hell no. Right? And this is, do you understand by scale the difference of this? Aside from the collapse of urbanism, we'll see now how Constantinople swallowed the entire rest of its dominions. By the 11th century, just Thessalonica, we've seen it also recent, was the only true city in the empire. The rest also very important towns. That now were towns, before were cities. I mean, think about Ephesus, think about Athens, think about what had been great centers like Pergamon. Like today, they do. I mean, today in the by after the early Middle Ages, these are not centers. These are not the great centers of the Hellenism of even late antiquity. What cities do you think that were actually more important at the time of the Crusades? Antioch or Milan? Athens or London? Thessaloniki or Paris? You see, all these cities were more from the ancient, say, that broader Greek world, were more important, way more important, still in late antiquity, or at least, well, maybe not so much. Actually, Milan, for example, was one of those big cities already by the late antiquity. Also, even Verona, that also later on in the Middle Ages, yes, was important to the degree, but it was not one of the largest cities ever, were bigger in late antiquity than most of these other centers. What happened? What did happen in between? I mean, you see, the so-called Dark Ages happened, allegedly, in the Latin Germanic world. What was happening in the Byzantine world? And sort of whose fault was that? At that point, it's not like the West had taken over the Byzantines. You see, that question, I don't remember if I actually phrased it before extensively, but was asking specifically again, but, you know, did Western civilization boom because the Byzantine one declined, say the Orthodox one, that was the dreadful expression, declined? given that in these times they were essentially in parallel, they were not really messing with one another in terms of conquest, etc., as it happens later with the Crusades and so on, it's evident that the West, it was a unitary Byzantine Empire by that point, that was also bigger, in fact, than most of these individually taken Romano-Germanic powers, was evidently doing something within itself for which, in the West instead, things were going at least far better. Also, the Byzantines have a recovery. The 8th century, the 9th century, a moment of greater recovery. Actually, during the 10th, the 11th, the Byzantines have still a lot of steam. They re-expand, whatever. But what happens to their system? Essentially, Constantinople, even just urbanly speaking, swallows everything else and atrophies it. The West is literally growing everywhere.